The US is in charge and it's prepared to strike Venezuela again. That's the threat from Donald Trump, who's warned Venezuela's interim leader to, quote, behave. The US president says Delcy Rodriguez risks paying a higher price than President Nicolas Maduro if she fails to cooperate with his administration. Trump has also threatened military action in Colombia and Mexico and described Cuba's communist regime as ready to fall. Rodriguez insists Venezuela aspires to live without external threats. She's invited the US to collaborate and prioritise moving towards balanced and respectful relations. The interim president had previously pledged that Maduro is the country's only president. US forces on Saturday bombed Caracas before its commandos captured Maduro and his wife. He's being held in a New York detention centre and is expected to appear in court at 17 GMT, that's midday New York time. He's facing 4 charges, including narco-terrorism conspiracy. The UN Security Council is set to hold an emergency session in the coming hours to discuss the US attack on Venezuela. John Brain begins our coverage.
Handcuffed and humiliated, the erstwhile leader of a nation of around 30 million people. But Nicolas Maduro's next public appearance will be in a New York courtroom as a suspected felon. He leaves behind a country reeling from the US military operation, which seized him from a safe house in the dead of night. Here, residents pick through the rubble of one of dozens of buildings reportedly destroyed by American missiles. Government officials say more than 40 people were killed. This is a country on edge, uncertain of what the future may hold. For now, this woman is in charge, Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Trump has threatened her with a fate worse than her predecessors if she refuses to cooperate.
So what do you need from Delcy Rodriguez? You've threatened Delcy.
Total access. We need total access. We need access to the oil and to other things in their country that allow us to rebuild their country.
After initial resistance, Rodriguez is now urging the US to collaborate, but the Venezuelan military remains defiant.
The Bolivarian National Armed Forces strongly rejects the cowardly kidnapping of citizen Nicolas Maduro Moros, constitutional president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, our commander-in-chief, and his wife.
In the US, opinion is divided. There's support for Maduro outside the Brooklyn detention center where he's currently being held. While at Doral in Florida, home of the country's largest Venezuelan community, his capture sparked 2 days of celebrations. There's little sympathy for the former Venezuelan leader from US lawmakers, but many are concerned about the legality of the operation.
Maduro's a horrible, horrible person, but you don't treat lawlessness with other lawlessness. We have learned through the years when America tries to do regime change and nation building in this way, the American people pay the price in both blood and in dollars.
The US Secretary of State has defended the decision not to consult Congress in advance.
It wasn't necessary because this was not an invasion. We didn't occupy a country. This was an arrest operation. This was a law enforcement operation. He was arrested on the ground in Venezuela by FBI agents.
But many lawmakers aren't satisfied with that response and are anxious about what might happen next. This week, the Senate is due to vote on a motion which would block further military action against Venezuela unless Congress approves it in advance. John Brain, TRT World, Washington.
We have our correspondents covering the latest developments for us from across the region. Leona Khani joins us from the US Capitol and Ana Vanessa Herrero is standing by in Caracas. But first, let's go to Martin Markovits, who's in New York for us. Martin, all eyes on New York. Nicolas Maduro and his wife are currently being held in detention in Brooklyn, but they are expected to front court sometime later today. What's the latest with that?
Yeah, former President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, are expected to be on court at noon today. They're facing drug trafficking charges, and they could get up to 40 years. This case is very, very controversial, as we know. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that Nicolas Maduro is one of the big drug traffickers in the world. He has accused the former president of being the head of a cartel called Cartel de Sol that is operated in the Venezuelan military. They have said that they have been one of the biggest producers of cocaine and biggest exporter of cocaine, and they have said that this will be the main case against Maduro. And this has created a big outcry all over the world because, like a lot of Democratic lawmakers say, they believe that the drug charges could be an excuse to actually remove the president because of the natural resources in Venezuela. We have to remember that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and both Trump and Secretary of State Rubio have said that this is a key resource that the United States needs to get to dominate over the region, over the United States and all over North America. But still, the court case is supposed to happen at noon today. There's expected to be a lot of protests outside of the courtroom. There has been protests against this situation, especially in Chicago, where demonstrators marched in front of Trump Tower yesterday. And we're expected to see a similar kind of movement today at court. Back to you.
Martin, elsewhere in New York, we are also expecting a meeting of the UN Security Council to get underway later on Monday. We believe that Colombia actually called for this meeting with the backing of Russia and China. What can we expect from that gathering?
Well, this is a very, very key thing. The United Nations has been long critical of the United States and its expansionist policies. We have to remember the Iraq War, that the United Nations was against George Bush going to Iraq right after 9/11. And we see a similar thing that could happen today. Colombia is very, very worried. Marco Rubio said, and Trump said, that Colombia could be next because they allege that Colombia is also a big cocaine trafficker. At the same time, Iran and Russia are worried that if the United States goes and does interventions all across this area, this could affect their own business interests. And like Alejandra Cortez Ocasio said, the congresswoman said that if the United States does this in Venezuela, they could do this all over the region. And like we said, Marco Rubio said that Cuba should be very, very concerned that the United States could do the same thing to them. So we're expected to see the United Nations push back against the United States and what it did to Venezuela this week. Back to you.
Okay, Martin Markovits, thanks so much for bringing us the latest from New York. Let's go now to our Leonie Lacani, who's in Washington, D.C. for us. Leonie, has Donald Trump clarified what his immediate plans are in Venezuela?
Well, so many questions still unanswered. President Trump is back in Washington. He's back from his holiday in Florida. And on the flight back, he spoke to reporters and he was asked all kinds of questions. Among them, who is in charge in Venezuela right now? And he said, we are in charge, as in the U.S. We know that the administration is in touch with Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president at the moment, or the interim leader of Venezuela at the moment. And Trump has been very clear that if she doesn't fall in line, he has threatened a second wave of strikes. And he's also said there would be a very big price to pay if she didn't fall in line. She has so far resisted until now. But now she says she's urging an agenda of cooperation with the United States. In addition to that, Trump was asked questions about, if there's going to be any elections anytime soon in Venezuela. And he said, look, we just want to get the country ready right now. He says it's a mess. He says he wants to see American oil companies going in, spending lots of money, investing in the infrastructure that needs to be updated. Now, all of these very big and grand plans, but of course they all take lots of time, lots of organization and planning. And right now we don't seem to have any details on any of those things.
And Leonie, is there any clearer indication as to what the Trump administration means when it says that Washington will be running Venezuela for the foreseeable future?
Well, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was asked about that. And he now says running Venezuela means running its policies to ensure that they are in line with the Venezuelan people, but also with U.S. national interests, he said. He also said that, look, Venezuela is still under quarantine. The U.S. would still be enforcing sanctions and seizing any sanctioned boats, as they have done in the past months. And he also was asked why the U.S. had decided to work with Delcy Rodriguez, who is part of Maduro's regime, if the motivation for the U.S. was partly to go against narco-terrorism and Maduro's regime. And he said, look, the immediate reality is what we have to work with, and that is whoever is on the ground. He was asked why he wasn't working with opposition figures, and he said a lot of the opposition figures were out of the country, and so they have to deal with whoever was there at the moment. All of this is drawing so many parallels with what the U.S. did back in 1990, where they went into Panama and captured Manuel Noriega, the leader of Panama at the time, brought him to the U.S. He was tried in the U.S. The difference in that situation was that as soon as the U.S. captured Noriega, they also swore in the opposition leaders. So there was no vacuum. There was no power vacuum at the time, although there were questions back then, as there are now, about the legality of the situation. So all of that, as we say, still uncertain, and a lot of uncertainty still, of course, for the people in Venezuela.
Okay, Leonie Nakani, thank you so much for updating us from Washington. Anna Vanessa Herrero is standing by for us in the Venezuelan capital now. Anna, we know that soon after Maduro was captured, Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as interim leader, and she had said that she'd condemned the US operation and only recognized Maduro as Venezuela's rightful leader. But since then, she struck a more conciliatory tone towards the United States. Tell us what she's had to say.
Yes, and I have to tell you, not even the wildest analyst could see that coming. Basically, Delcy Rodriguez had a change of heart overnight. First, she was a fierce defender of Nicolas Maduro's presidency, and she, as you will said that Nicolas Maduro was the only president of Venezuela. Then next day, after a few threats from Donald Trump, she is now inviting the United States, Donald Trump, to cooperation agenda. And we would have to wait and see how the base of Chavismo is going to react to this. Because let's not forget, she is now inviting to cooperate, inviting to talk the same person who a day before not only attacked the Venezuelan capital, but also, as she said, kidnapped the Venezuelan president. So this situation definitely feels like the Delcy Rodriguez and the members of the government that were left behind are either trapped and with no support to negotiate any other way, or they are just, some people I've talked to on the streets, and this is very interesting, thought that they were in this situation altogether from the beginning.
And Anna, does the interim leader have the full support of the Venezuelan state at this point?
Well, she has the support of the cabinet of the people that were left behind, and that supported Maduro until his capture on Saturday. Now, that is, we would have to wait and see if she has the support of the bases of those people who are fierce, the defenders of sovereignty and against the U.S. and Donald Trump. This is a very interesting moment, and this also comes in a time when Maduro is about to appear in front of a U.S. court, and the contrast of the amount of power that they said they had and control they said they had, and now they're just following an agenda that Trump is almost more or less imposing over there. I would like to see the consequences that would have on the basis and followers of Nicolas Maduro and the Chavismo.
Okay, I know, Vanessa, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for bringing us the latest from Caracas. Well, joining us from Sydney now is Marcus Wagner. He's a Professor of Law and International Peace and Security at the University of Wollongong. Really good to have you with us, Professor. I guess the big question from an international law perspective is whether or not what the Trump administration has done in attacking Venezuela and capturing its leader is legal.
Thanks so much for having me. Look, Marco Rubio characterizes this as a law enforcement action, and for maybe domestic purposes from a U.S. law perspective, one can potentially make a claim to that. But it's fairly clear that from an international law perspective, the U.S. just violated the prohibition on the use of force, which is enshrined in the UN Charter and what we call customary international law. And that basically says that all members shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity. And what the U.S. has done is a military action against another member of the United Nations. Captured the president, Nicolas Maduro, and brought him to U.S. territory. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that rule. One is the action could be authorized by the United Nations Security Council, which didn't happen, or you can try to make to claim the right of self-defense. The problem here is that this claim would basically then constitute the drug trafficking that the government of Venezuela is alleged to have committed would have to be an armed attack against the United States. And at least in the history so far, drug trafficking just hasn't constituted an armed attack against the United States, against another country. And so I and most of my colleagues really can't see a reason for justification, and therefore the violation of Article 2.4 still remains. So that's a real problem that we're finding ourselves in.
We are expecting a meeting of the UN Security Council to take place in New York later on Monday. Apparently that meeting was called for by Colombia and is being backed by Russia and China. No doubt the issue of legality will be raised at this gathering, but what realistically could the UN Security Council do in response to this US operation?
Realistically, almost nothing. We might see a declaration by the remaining members of the Security Council, but the United States is one of the so-called permanent 5 members of the Security Council, which carry a veto with them. So any action or any resolution that might want to be passed, that other members might want to pass, would be vetoed by the United States.
And what about the issue of whether or not Venezuela's government was legitimate? Because we know we had both the Trump and Biden administrations declare Maduro's government illegitimate. We had the EU making a similar declaration. Does that go some way in justifying the Trump administration's operation?
Legally speaking, no. One might lament that. And from my own perspective, Nicolas Maduro was the head of a dictatorial regime. But legally speaking, no. Now, there's a political question that sometimes overrides, if you will, or goes alongside. And here, I think we're seeing ourselves in a very complicated situation. Your correspondents have already alluded to this, whether there's a popular uprising, with a whole range of different power centers in Venezuela now vying for the top spot. We've seen developments very likely due to U.S. pressure against the former vice president, now president, Delcy Rodriguez. But all of this is going to become very complicated. And it doesn't look like the Venezuelan people will have what one would call the right of self-determination in a meaningful sense, but that rather the idea is to get access to the minerals in Venezuela, which seems to have been the plan all along. And now we're seeing this idea of running the country And I put running in quotation marks because it doesn't seem to be clear what that actually means in the eyes of the Trump administration.
Okay, Professor, we will have to leave it there. Really good to get your thoughts on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
On paper, Nicolas Maduro was captured for alleged narco-terrorism, but Trump himself has admitted that more factors were at play. The US president says Saturday's operation was in part prompted by Venezuela's decision to nationalize oil US interests decades ago. Despite its massive reserves, Venezuela's oil production has been in decline. Its output averaged a little more than 1 million barrels per day last year. With an estimated 300 billion barrels, or a global total of 17%, Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. They surpass Saudi Arabia, Iran and Iraq, and are more than 3 times those of the US. 60 years ago, under American and British control, Venezuela's production peaked at around 3.5 million barrels a day of crude. At the time, this accounted for roughly 7% of global output. After former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry in the late 90s, production fell. It continued to drop sharply under his successor, Nicolas Maduro, declining further after US sanctions in 2019. Well, let's get more on this now with Mario Arturo Ruiz Estrada. He's a professor of international economics at the University of Kuala Lumpur. Really good to have you with us, Professor. It is becoming increasingly clear that Venezuela's vast oil reserves have played a major factor in prompting the Trump administration's operation in Venezuela. In your view, to what extent is oil the driving factor behind this?
I want to give my perspective from an economic perspective. I think everybody is now discussing about politics and diplomacy, but I want to go directly to the economic issues. I want to tell you something. The stock markets don't have a high impact. The invasion was irrelevant. And I tell you, the Trump administration is what they did is a show. But they not change the Venezuela. The Venezuelan government continued it. Yes, the only thing was remove Maduro, but continue the same structure. Why United States want Venezuela is because they want to take the oil and supply to Europe because Russia is not selling any more oil to Europe. And this is the big issue. Behind this invasion of Venezuela is to take the oil and supply to Europe because Europe don't have resources of oil anymore. Like last time Russia selling oil in cheap prices to all Europe in energy and industry. They are interrelated. And now it's very costly in many industries, and Europe are doing very badly. Now the idea to take Venezuela is to get this oil and supply to Europe. This is the main strategy behind geopolitically. One more issue we need to mention, the prices drop, not have high impact. The stock market Monday was very light, the increments. It's not have high impact, was irrelevant. Something I can see is that this situation is that we have more speculation in the market, in the oil market. It's not going to have any improvement. And I can say that now the American economy is trying to thinking that we take Venezuela is going to generate economic growth. And it's not true. It's not true. Yes. Because these resources is Venezuelan resources, and this is a pure stealing.
Okay.
This is piracy.
Professor, I want to ask you about the oil infrastructure in Venezuela, because Donald Trump says that in taking control of the country, he wants to allow US companies to enter Venezuela, pour billions of dollars to modernize the oil infrastructure with the view of pumping that crude to the rest of the world. How realistic is that prospect, do you think, and how long will it take for those US companies to get in there and to update the infrastructure?
And personally, from an economic perspective of view, bring the companies is going to only exploit the oil, but it's not going to have any benefit to Venezuelans, the Venezuelan people. It's going to be an extraction of oil, make more rich the multinational companies of oil, and that's all. It's not going to have a high impact. We need to see the perspective, the impact of this oil is benefit Venezuelan, because this is Venezuelan oil. It's not American oil. The companies can extract any quantity of oil, But we need to remember that these companies need to pay tax for the extraction of the oil, but they don't think they're going to pay because looks like they took over, like it's from them last past. Actually, the government invests a lot in infrastructure to extract oil in Venezuela. It's nothing new. What they have before is true, but actually, the nationalization of the oil company of Venezuela is nothing new. It's so many years back. But my point is, who is going to get benefit if these private large companies take the oil? Venezuela?
Yes.
The people. And this is my question to this program, is we need to see the perspective and who is going to get benefits from this extraction of oil. This is my point of view.
Yes, and that is the open question, isn't it? Professor Estrada, thank you so much again for joining us on the program.